Greetings from St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Sherman, Texas. My name's Father Wesley Evans, and today I want to talk a little bit about interpreting the Bible and reading the Bible. The last video I did was on why there are so many different Bibles, and I haven't talked about how to read the Bible. During the Middle Ages, there developed what I find a very helpful idea of interpreting the Bible, a hermeneutic. A hermeneutic is just a fancy word for a system, an organized way of reading the text. And they had what they called the four senses of Scripture: the literal sense, the allegorical sense, the moral sense, and the anagogical sense. I'm not going to talk about all of those today, but I want to talk a little bit about the literal sense, because the literal meaning has gets a bad rap very, very often. In fact, very often people say, well, I don't take the Bible literally. Well, of course they do sometimes. I mean, nobody that I've met anyway so far that says that. If you turn to the part where Jesus says, love your neighbor, they go, well, Jesus didn't mean that literally. It was like a metaphor for being nice to the people you like, right? People don't say that. Everybody takes it somehow literally. I know what they mean, but let's not degrade the term literal. If you need another word, however, for literal, a more technical term is grammatico-historical interpretation. Regardless of each way, all this means, all the literal sense means, is what does the text say? What are the letters? Or the word literal from letters, that's what it means. What is it saying? If the text says that Jesus walked to Jerusalem, then the literal interpretation is Jesus walked to Jerusalem. That's all it means, okay? Now, a few things about this. First off, literal interpretation does not mean Amelia Bedelia. I remember those books when I was a kid. Maybe some of you do too, right? And if you don't remember, there's a character. It's a children's book. There's a character in it named Amelia Bedelia. And she is often told to things or hears things, and she has no sense of metaphor, no sense of idiom, no sense of figures of speech. And so at one point they say Amelia Bedelia hit the road, and she walks outside and she starts beating it with a stick. Or she's a substitute teacher and she reads an instruction that says call the roll. So she gets a roll out of her lunch bag and starts calling the roll. That's not what literal means. It really isn't. And some people might be using it that way, but that's not what it means, okay? It doesn't mean Amelia Bedelia interpretation. It's not like Drax from Guardians of the Galaxy really was my favorite character in that movie. He was hilarious. But that's not what literal interpretation is about. Literal interpretation does take into account figures of speech, metaphors. God is a strong rock, a castle to keep us safe. Things of that nature. It's not saying that God is a rock object. And I don't know anyone in the strongest, even fundamentalist circles. I grew up going to an independent fundamentalist Baptist church in Coolamy, North Carolina. They did not take that verse that way, okay? I've not met this caricature, or at least maybe God has kept me from it, but I have not met this caricature of literal interpretation that doesn't take into account things of that nature. And so one thing about sort of jumping from there in terms of poetry, metaphor, figures of speech, those kinds of things, is literal interpretation takes the genre into account. Genre is the type of text. Poetry or law or history or apocalyptic, or we can just, some scholars might divide where apocalyptic fits, etc. But genre is just the type of writing. If, for instance, you were to read the sentence, and the sun rose out of the eastern sea, if you were to read that in your science textbook, you would probably mark it wrong, and you'd argue, well, the sun doesn't really do that. And you'd be correct. It doesn't rise out of the sea. But if you're reading a poem where somebody says that, and you're some people might say, well, it doesn't really do that. And the proper response would be, but it's a poem. It's okay, right? Poetry is different from a science textbook, is different from history, is different from law, is different. So genre matters, particularly in interpretation. Okay? For instance, history. Oh, now this is an important point, so highlight this in your mind. One of the differences sometimes that genre affects is whether something is descriptive or prescriptive. Descriptive or prescriptive. Prescriptive are things that are commanded, prescribed. Descriptive are things that are described. If a law is there, if it's a legal idea, right? And for Israel, for instance, the Torah is the law. When God says do X, it's the law to do X. That's prescriptive. In the history books, so First and Second Chronicles and First and Second Samuel, even the Gospels, and the Book of Acts, some things might be descriptive. So if it describes an evil king, for instance, if it describes someone lying, it's not saying that's okay. It's describing an event. Okay, it's describing something happening. It's describing what somebody says. Right? So if the Bible says, and I should have looked up a specific verse, but if it says something on the lines of, and lo, so-and-so said, etc., etc., the Bible is accurately recording what they're saying. It's not necessarily endorsing what they're saying. I mean, unless it says, and the word of the Lord spoke, that's fine, but I get that. If it says, and God said, but it doesn't always. In fact, the book of Judges is all about, there's one refrain that happens in the book of Judges all the time. And there was no king in Israel in those days, therefore everyone did what is right in their own eyes. So all the stories in Judges have a point. They're to describe how bad things are. Okay, so a story from the book of Judges, and you go, wow, that's horrible. That person did something, right? Well, but is the Bible endorsing it, or is it describing something that happens? Okay, so that also gets into issues of the regulative principle, which we do not hold to in the Episcopal Church, and I'll do another video on that in worship. But descriptive versus prescriptism, sometimes that's an issue of genre. I want to touch back on the metaphor thing, though. It is true, certainly, the Bible has metaphor, figure of speech, and we need to look out for those things. One thing about metaphor, and I think this is where some of the debates get, this is where maybe some of the cultural issues came into it, is that it is true there are metaphors and figures of speech and allegory and all those, and analogies as well in the Bible. But we do need to be careful, right? We can't say, well, this is a metaphor just because I don't like the idea, or it's a metaphor because it's supernatural, or something along those lines. I think what happened, it seems, is if there, just due to history, there was a rejection of much of the supernatural in the Bible, and so what do you do with it? And so there was an aspect of Christians, one group of Christians, who started saying, well, then the supernatural doesn't exist, it's all metaphor. Well, us saying we don't like it or don't believe it doesn't mean it's a metaphor. Okay, that's not a good enough reason. That doesn't mean there aren't metaphors. A couple of examples we might use in how to work with metaphors and how to work with the cultural context of a text. One might be the Leviathan in Job. So Job talks about this Leviathan. It's described as having scales and even breathing fire. It's basically a dragon. Yes, there's a dragon in the Bible. It's really cool. And the Leviathan comes out of the sea, comes out of the ocean. In the ancient world, in the ancient Near East that Israel lived in, the ocean was often a symbol of chaos and evil and destruction. And so we have a good chance, very strong likelihood, that what Job is referring to, what's being referred to in the book of Job, is a symbol of chaos. In other words, when God comes down to Job and says, can you lift Leviathan by a hook? He's saying, can you bring order out of chaos? That seems to be indicated because God also says, were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me and stand if you can. God's challenge to Job is in that context of creation. And in Genesis 1, we have a story that God made order out of chaos. And so that's very likely to be metaphor. The resurrection, on the other hand, the resurrection of Jesus, the word resurrection didn't have any other meaning in the ancient world. To take it in its historic and cultural context, and we have to interpret the Bible in its cultural and historical context, not to say that it's wrong. You don't go, well, this was just its cultural context and the culture was bad, therefore, okay. Do the descriptive, prescriptive thing, because some of the culture at the time was bad, and God condemns it, or it's a descriptive thing and shows what happens. But the resurrection was the earliest testimony of the Christian faith, and the resurrection meant physical resurrection. It was pretty clear what it meant. In fact, when when Peter proclaims it, I mean, there are people, Greeks, that are very confused. It's like, wait a minute, is he really saying what I think he's saying? They weren't so sure about this. So resurrection pretty much has one concept. If we have a hard time understanding how God could bring a dead body back to life, that's more our problem, not an issue of interpreting it literally or not. So literal does take genre into account, does take metaphor into account, it's not Amelia Bedelia literal, but that doesn't mean we throw out the weird, the supernatural aspect. It doesn't mean we remove parts of the text we don't like. It doesn't mean any of that. But it also doesn't mean sort of a crass literalism that I think some people think it might. So hopefully that helped answer a few questions some of you may have had about literal interpretation. If you have more, please leave them in the comments below so I can address them next time. Maybe do a follow-up, and I will talk more about the Bible next time. Thank you all very much. Remember, Sundays 9:30 is our worship. Please come join us downtown Sherman, St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. God bless.